Every single day, people around the world spend anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 on a single Rolex watch. Some spend even more. It has become the ultimate symbol of success. The one thing you buy yourself when you have finally made it. But almost nobody knows the story of the man who built it. He was not born into wealth. By the time he was 12 years old, he had already lost everything that mattered. His mother, his father, and the family business his grandfather had built. He was completely alone in the world at 12 years old with nothing but a refusal to give up. This is how an orphan boy from Bavaria created the most famous watch brand in history, a small town in Bavaria, Germany. His family ran a moderately successful business, and life was comfortable. Hans was a bright, curious child who loved mathematics and languages. French and English came naturally to him, alongside his native German. Then everything fell apart. His mother died when Hans was still a young boy. Before he could even fully process that loss, his father died shortly after. By the time Hans Wilsdorf was 12 years old, he was an orphan. In his own words, years later, he wrote, simply, "My mother's early death was soon followed by that of my father's, and at age 12, I was an orphan." His uncles took charge of the children and made a practical decision. They sold the family business and used the money to send. It was meant to be a generous act. To Hans, it felt like being abandoned all over again. He was unhappy at boarding school, often isolated, and struggled to fit in. But instead of falling apart, he did what would define his entire life. He turned inward and focused. He became exceptional at his studies. Mathematics, languages, precision thinking. These were not just school subjects to Hans. They were survival tools, and they would eventually become the foundation of everything he built. By the time he finished school, Hans Wilsdorf had one clear goal. He was not going to work for someone else's dream. He was going to build his own. In 1900, at the age of 19, Hans moved to La Chaux de France, a company that exported Swiss pocket watches. His job was to handle correspondence in 3 languages, German, French, and English. Most people would have seen it as a simple office job. Hans saw it as a masterclass in the watch business. He watched everything, how they were sold across borders, just saw a young office worker writing letters. And during this time, he noticed something that would change everything. Pocket watches were everywhere. Everyone had them. But they were bulky, inconvenient, and you had to take them out of your pocket every time you wanted to check the time. Hans began to wonder, what if a watch could sit on your wrist instead? In 1905, at just 24 years old, he moved to London and founded a small company with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. They called it Wilsdorf and Davis. They imported wristwatches in England. There was just one problem. Nobody wanted wristwatches. At the time, wristwatches were considered a joke. Men wore pocket watches. Wristwatches were seen as feminine accessories, delicate, inaccurate, and unreliable. People said openly that no mechanism that small could ever keep accurate time. Hans heard this constantly and ignored it completely. He was absolutely certain the world was wrong, and he was going to prove it. Hans Wilsdorf understood something most watchmakers of his era completely missed. That accuracy was not enough. People needed to trust a watch before they would wear one, and trust had to be earned through proof, not promises. So he went after official certification, movements to Switzerland's official watch rating center in Bienne. In 1910, his Rolex wristwatch became the first wristwatch in history to receive a Swiss certificate of chronometric precision, proof from an independent authority that his watches kept accurate time. Then in 1914, the Kew Observatory in London, one of the most respected scientific institutions in the world at the time, awarded Rolex a class, a precision certificate. This was the highest accuracy rating given to any timepiece. Pocket watches rarely achieved it. A wristwatch had never achieved it before. He used both certifications aggressively in his marketing. He was proving to the world, one certificate at a time, that wristwatches were not a joke. They were the future. But then came the first great crisis. Government imposed a 33% tax on all goods exported from British registered companies. Overnight, Rolex watches became 33% more expensive than their foreign competitors. Sales collapsed. A lesser man would have been finished. Hans relocated the entire company to Switzerland, first to Bienne, and then permanently to Geneva in 1919. He was stateless, rebuilding in a foreign country, with a brand most of the world still did not take seriously. And still, he kept going. By the mid-1920s, Hans Wilsdorf had built a solid watch company, but he wanted something bigger. He wanted Rolex to be legendary. And to do that, he needed to do something nobody had ever done before. In 1926, he invented the Rolex Oyster, the world's first waterproof wristwatch. The case was screwed shut so tightly that water simply could not get inside. It was a revolutionary engineering achievement. But Hans knew that telling people a watch was waterproof was not enough. He needed to show them. In 1927, he heard about a young English typist named Mercedes Gleitz who was attempting to swim across the English Channel, a grueling 20-mile crossing through freezing cold water. Hans saw his opportunity immediately. He asked her to wear a Rolex Oyster during the swim. She wore it for over 15 hours in the English Channel. When she finally emerged from the water, the watch was in perfect condition. It had not stopped. It had not flooded. It was still keeping perfect time. Hans then took out a full front-page advertisement in the Daily Mail, one of the most read newspapers in England. To announce the result to the world, the image of a watch surviving 15 hours in the English Channel made headlines everywhere. Rolex became famous overnight. He did not stop there. Inside every Rolex dealership he placed his Oyster watches inside glass tanks filled with real water and live fish. So, customers could see the watches running perfectly underwater before they bought them. It was brilliant, theatrical, and completely unforgettable. He was a genuine innovator who pushed the limits of what watches could do. In 1931, he invented and patented the perpetual rotor, a mechanism using the natural movement of the wearer's wrist. Before this invention, all watches had to be manually wound by hand every single day. The Rolex Oyster Perpetual wound itself as long as the person wearing it was alive and moving. It sounds simple now. At the time, it was considered almost impossible to engineer at that scale of precision. Hans spent years developing it, and it worked perfectly. Watchmakers around the world studied it, copied it, and built on it. The self-winding movement today traces directly back to what Hans Wilsdorf invented in 1931. By this point, Rolex was no longer just a watch company. It was the standard against which all other watches were measured. Hans Wilsdorf died in Geneva on July 6, 1960, at the age of 79. He had no children. Instead of leaving Rolex to a family he did not have, he placed the entire company inside a charitable foundation, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, which owns Rolex to this day. The profits fund charitable causes in Geneva and around the world. A company worth over $8 billion owned by nobody and given to everyone. He had started life as a 12-year-old orphan with nothing. He died having built one of the most recognizable brands in human history, having invented the waterproof watch, the self-winding movement, and having turned the product everyone laughed at into the ultimate symbol of human achievement. The next time you see someone wearing a Rolex, remember the orphan boy from Bavaria who refused to let the world tell him what was possible. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next one is just as powerful.